A simple ring from Jimin sparks unexpected jealousy in Jungkook, awakening hidden emotions and changing their friendship forever. The velvet box slipped from Jimin's trembling fingers just as Jungkook pushed open the practice room door, and for one suspended heartbeat, the silver ring resting inside looked exactly like the beginning of a proposal. Silence crashed into the room harder than music ever could. Jungkook stopped walking. His eyes locked onto the ring before slowly rising to Jimin's face, searching for an explanation that never came. Across the room stood a young volunteer named Minyu, smiling awkwardly with one hand stretched forward, completely unaware that he had become the center of a storm. Jimin inhaled sharply. "I finally found it." His voice barely reached the other side of the room. The ring shimmered beneath the white fluorescent lights, its polished surface reflecting fragments of everyone's expressions: confusion, curiosity, and on Jungkook's face, something far more dangerous: jealousy, not loud, not explosive, the quiet kind that slowly poisoned every heartbeat. Without another word, Jungkook turned around and walked away. The sound of the closing door echoed through the empty practice hall. Jimin stared after him, feeling an unfamiliar heaviness settle inside his chest. He knew exactly what Jungkook had misunderstood, but somehow, he couldn't bring himself to run after him. Because explaining the truth suddenly felt much harder than letting the misunderstanding exist. Outside, evening rain began tapping softly against the windows. The city lights blurred beneath the wet glass, turning Seoul into a watercolor of gold and blue. Minyu lowered his hand and laughed nervously. "I think your friend misunderstood." Jimin forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "He always assumes the worst when he doesn't know the whole story. You should tell him." "I know." But he didn't move. Instead, he closed the velvet box again, holding it carefully in both hands. The ring wasn't expensive. It wasn't rare. It wasn't even new. Its silver edges had become smooth after years of being touched by someone else's hands. That was exactly why it mattered. 5 years earlier, Jimin had volunteered at a children's art center every Saturday morning. He met an elderly music teacher there named Mrs. Han. She carried countless stories hidden behind her gentle smile and tired eyes. One rainy afternoon, after helping clean the classroom, Jimin noticed the small silver ring lying forgotten beside an old piano. Mrs. Han smiled sadly when she saw it. "My husband gave me that ring before he left for military service." She gently rotated it between her fingers. It wasn't an engagement ring. It wasn't a wedding ring. It was simply a promise. "Promise?" She nodded. "He said that people always think love begins with expensive jewelry." She laughed quietly. "But sometimes love begins with someone remembering your favorite tea, waiting until you arrive safely, keeping a promise no one else remembers." She placed the ring back into its tiny box. "I want someone else to understand that someday." Months later, Mrs. Han passed away peacefully. Among the belongings she left behind was a handwritten letter addressed to Jimin. Inside was the same velvet box. The letter contained only one request: "When you find someone who still believes kindness matters more than grand gestures, give them this ring." For years, Jimin carried it everywhere. He never found the right person. Not until he met Minyu. Minyu wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He simply spent every weekend delivering meals to elderly people living alone. He repaired broken bicycles for neighborhood children without asking for payment. He remembered everyone's birthdays, and he always smiled first. Mrs. Han's words returned every time Jimin watched him helping strangers. Today had finally felt right. The ring wasn't a confession, it wasn't romance. It wasn't even a symbol of love, it was gratitude. A reminder that kindness deserved to be passed forward. Yet Jungkook had seen only 1 second of the entire story. One ring, one open box, one misunderstanding. Sometimes that was enough. Meanwhile, Jungkook wandered aimlessly beneath the rain without opening his umbrella. Cars splashed water across empty streets. Neon reflections trembled beneath his shoes. His chest felt strangely tight. He kept replaying the image: Jimin smiling, the ring, another person. He hated how quickly his imagination filled the gaps. Why did it hurt so much? Why had his first instinct been to leave? He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. It shouldn't matter. Jimin was free to give anyone anything, free to smile at anyone, free to make memories with anyone. So why? Why did it feel like something precious had quietly slipped away before he even realized he had been holding it? His phone vibrated. A message from Jimin appeared. I wanted to explain. Stared at the screen for a long time, then locked it without replying, because deep inside, he wasn't afraid of hearing the truth. He was afraid that the truth might prove he had never meant as much to Jimin as he secretly wished. Back inside the practice building, Jimin remained alone. He placed the velvet box on the piano. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the evening sky. His fingers traced the worn silver edges before he whispered into the empty room. I hope one day you'll understand why this ring was never about love. Rain continued falling, washing the city in silver while two hearts drifted farther apart, not because of betrayal, not because of lies, but because of a single moment that neither of them truly understood. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight, but neither Jimin nor Jungkook felt its warmth. The practice room, usually filled with playful laughter and effortless conversations, felt strangely unfamiliar. Every movement echoed louder than usual. Every glance lingered a second too long before quickly looking away. Jimin arrived first. He placed his backpack beside the piano and quietly began arranging sheets of music. Hopping the repetitive motion would calm the storm inside him. It didn't. His mind kept returning to the image of Jungkook standing frozen in the doorway, his eyes silently asking questions Jimin had never imagined he would have to answer. The door slid open. Jungkook entered. For a brief second their eyes met. Neither smiled, neither greeted the other. The silence between them carried more weight than any argument ever could. One by one the rest of the members arrived, immediately sensing the unusual atmosphere. Something happened? Taehyung asked, looking from one to the other. No, Jimin answered too quickly. We're fine, Jungkook added almost at the same time. Their answers overlapped perfectly. Ironically, that only made the lie more obvious. Nobody pressed the issue. Rehearsal began. The music filled the room, yet something essential was missing. Normally. Jimin and Jungkook instinctively understood each other's timing without exchanging a single word. They anticipated every movement, every pause, every transition. Today they hesitated, they missed cues. They accidentally stepped into each other's space before quickly pulling away. Even the choreographer noticed. Again. Music restarted. This time Jungkook focused entirely on counting the beats. 1, 2, 3. Anything except looking toward Jimin. Meanwhile, Jimin struggled to concentrate. His thoughts wandered back to Mrs. Han's letter folded carefully inside his notebook. Maybe. He should have told Jungkook about it years ago, not because the ring belonged to him, but because Jungkook had always been the first person Jimin shared important things with. When had that changed, or perhaps it hadn't changed? Perhaps fear had quietly replaced honesty. After rehearsal ended, everyone dispersed for lunch. Jungkook slipped out before anyone could stop him. He wandered into a quiet cafe tucked between two narrow streets where the aroma of roasted coffee beans mingled with the scent of fresh rain lingering outside. He chose the table beside the window, not because he liked the view, because it reminded him of another rainy afternoon years earlier. Back then, he and Jimin had hidden inside this same cafe after being caught in a sudden downpour. Their clothes had been soaked. Their hair dripped onto the wooden floor. They laughed so hard that strangers smiled simply from watching them. Jimin had ordered 2 hot chocolates. You always look less worried when you're holding something warm, he had said. Jungkook smiled despite himself at the memory. He had never realized Jimin remembered tiny details like that, or perhaps Jimin remembered everyone's little habits. Maybe he had never been special after all. The thought settled heavily in his chest. The waitress approached. Usual. Jungkook blinked in surprise. You remember, she smiled. You and your friend used to come here often. Friend, such a simple word, yet hearing it now felt unexpectedly painful. Across town, Jimin found himself standing in front of Mrs. Han's old music center. The building had closed months earlier, but flowers still bloomed beneath the windows where children once practiced singing every Saturday morning. An elderly caretaker was sweeping fallen leaves near the entrance. He recognized Jimin immediately. You came back. I needed to think. The caretaker smiled gently. Still carrying her ring? Jimin nodded. I gave it away yesterday. The old man leaned on his broom. Then why do you look like you've lost something instead? Jimin lowered his eyes. Someone misunderstood. The caretaker chuckled softly. Misunderstandings don't grow because people make mistakes. They grow because frightened hearts stay silent. Those words lingered in Jimin's mind long after he left. As evening approached, the sky turned shades of orange and violet. Jungkook eventually returned to the company building, expecting it to be empty. Instead, faint piano music drifted through the hallway. He recognized the melody instantly. It was the first song he and Jimin had ever composed together. Curiosity drew him closer. The practice room door stood slightly open. Inside, Jimin sat alone at the piano. He wasn't performing. He wasn't rehearsing. He simply played absent-mindedly, stopping every few measures as if memories interrupted his fingers. Jungkook remained hidden behind the door. For the first time since yesterday, he looked at Jimin without anger, only sadness. He noticed the exhaustion beneath Jimin's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped, the hesitation before every note. It didn't look like someone celebrating after giving a meaningful gift. It looked like someone quietly regretting losing a friend. Jimin stopped playing. Without turning around, he spoke into the empty room. "I wish you had asked me." Jungkook's heartbeat skipped. Had Jimin seen him? No matter how painful the answer, Jimin whispered, "I would have told you everything." His voice cracked. "Never wanted a ring to become a wall between us." Jungkook remained motionless. His hand rested on the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to step inside. For the first time, he began to wonder whether the story he had imagined in his mind had been completely different from the truth, and whether the person he had hurt most was not himself, but Jimin. Jungkook stood outside the practice room for what felt like an eternity, his hand still resting on the cold metal doorknob. The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the final notes of the piano fading into stillness. Inside, Jimin closed the lid of the piano with careful hands. He had no idea Jungkook was only a few steps away. For a brief moment, Jungkook considered opening the door. Just one push, one conversation, one chance to ask the question that had been haunting him since yesterday. Instead, he stepped back. The floor creaked beneath his shoe. Jimin looked toward the door instinctively. "Who's there?" No answer came. By the time he reached the hallway, it was empty. Only the soft glow of the emergency light stretched across the polished floor. Jimin sighed quietly. So close. He wasn't sure why those words escaped his lips. Perhaps because something inside him kept insisting that Jungkook had been there. The following morning began with a photo shoot for an upcoming magazine. Stylists hurried between dressing rooms while cameras flashed endlessly against bright white backdrops. Everyone smiled on cue. Everyone laughed when instructed. Everyone appeared perfectly comfortable. Only Jimin and Jungkook knew how carefully they were avoiding each other's eyes. During a short break, the photographer reviewed the pictures on his monitor. "They're beautiful," he said, then he frowned. "Except these." He enlarged several photographs. Every member looked natural, everyone except Jimin and Jungkook. Although they stood shoulder to shoulder, an invisible distance separated them. Their smiles never reached each other. Their eyes looked elsewhere. The photographer scratched his head. "You two usually have the easiest chemistry." Jungkook forced a smile. "We're just tired." Photographer accepted the explanation, but the words echoed in Jimin's mind. Chemistry. Had they really lost it that quickly? Later that afternoon, everyone gathered in the lounge while waiting for the next schedule. Taehyung dropped onto the sofa beside Jungkook. "Barely spoken to Jimin. I'm just busy." "You've been busy with avoiding him." Remained silent. Taehyung wasn't the type to pry, yet today his expression softened with unusual seriousness. "Can I tell you something?" Jungkook nodded. "When people matter to us." Taehyung looked toward the rain outside the window. "Our imagination becomes our worst enemy." Jungkook looked at him. "What do you mean?" "We start believing stories we've written ourselves. Sometimes those stories hurt more than reality ever could." The words struck deeper than Taehyung realized. Jungkook remembered every detail from that afternoon. He had never asked, never listened, never waited. He had simply assumed. Across the room, Jimin sat quietly reading a small folded letter. Its paper had yellowed with age. The edges were worn from being opened countless times. He read Mrs. Hand's handwriting again. "If someone receives this ring, it means you believe their kindness deserves to continue changing the world. Never let anyone mistake kindness for possession." Jimin smiled sadly. I tried, he whispered. He folded the letter once more before placing it carefully inside the velvet box. Just then Minyu entered the lounge carrying several paper bags. I brought lunch for everyone. Warm smiles spread across the room as the members thanked him. Minyu noticed Jimin sitting alone and walked over. I wanted to tell you something. Jimin looked up. I can't accept the ring. Jimin blinked. What? Minho gently placed the velvet box back onto the table. It means too much. I don't deserve something that carries another person's memories. Jimin looked at the box in silence. I wasn't giving it because you deserved it more than anyone else. I was giving it because I believed you'd protect what it represents. Minho smiled warmly. I don't need a ring to remind me to be kind. He pushed the box gently toward Jimin, but maybe someone else does. Before Jimin could answer, Minyu excused himself to greet the others. Across the lounge, Jungkook had witnessed everything. He hadn't heard every word, but he saw the velvet box returning to Jimin's hands. Confusion replaced the certainty he had clung to for 2 days. If it had truly been a romantic gift, why had it been returned? Questions crowded his thoughts until they became impossible to ignore. That evening, as the building gradually emptied, Jungkook found himself standing outside the rooftop door. He knew Jimin often came there whenever he needed to think. Taking a slow breath, he climbed the final flight of stairs. The rooftop welcomed him with cool evening wind. The city stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in deep shades of purple and amber. Near the safety railing stood Jimin, quietly watching the lights flicker across the skyline. He didn't turn around. I wondered how long it would take before you came. Jungkook stopped a few steps behind him. You knew it was me, Jimin smiled faintly. Recognized your footsteps for years. The words settled gently between them, no anger, no accusation, only honesty. Jungkook lowered his eyes. I saw Minyu return the ring. Jimin nodded. He did. After a long silence, Jungkook finally asked the question he should have asked from the beginning. What does that ring really mean? Jimin looked at the velvet box resting in his hands. For the first time since everything had begun, he was ready to tell the entire story.
Jimin held the velvet box with both hands, as though the fragile object carried not only a ring but an entire lifetime of memories. The evening breeze swept across the rooftop, carrying the scent of rain-soaked concrete and distant pine trees from the hills beyond the city. Below them, traffic moved like rivers of gold beneath the fading twilight. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Jimin opened the box. The silver ring caught the last ray of sunlight before dusk surrendered completely to night. It isn't valuable, Jimin said quietly, at least, not in the way people usually measure value. Jungkook remained silent. I met someone years ago. His voice was calm, almost nostalgic. An elderly music teacher named Mrs. Han. As Jimin spoke, his eyes softened with memories. He described the little music center where children laughed between piano lessons, where the scent of old books mixed with fresh flowers, and where Mrs. Han always greeted everyone as though they were family. She told me that people spend their lives waiting for grand gestures. Jimin smiled faintly. But the strongest promises are often the quietest. He handed the velvet box to Jungkook. Inside rested the folded letter. Jungkook unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant despite its age. If this ring ever reaches someone's hand, let it remind them that kindness can outlive the people who first gave it. Never wear it as proof that someone belongs to you. Carry it only as proof that compassion can be passed from one heart to another. Jungkook read the words again, then a third time. The tightness in his chest slowly transformed into something heavier, not jealousy, regret. I thought, he whispered. I know, Jimin didn't sound angry. I saw your face the moment you walked into the room. I should have asked. You should have. Jungkook lowered his head. I imagined everything. You imagined the worst. A faint laugh escaped Jimin. So did I. Jungkook looked up. What do you mean? I imagined you wouldn't believe me even if I explained. The confession surprised them both. Fear had shaped each of their choices in different ways. Jungkook feared losing someone precious. Jimin feared that honesty would no longer be enough. Between those two fears, silence had quietly grown. I'm sorry, Jungkook said. The words came without hesitation. I wasn't jealous because of the ring. He paused, searching for the courage to finish. I was jealous because I suddenly realized how frightened I was of becoming someone you no longer needed. Jimin's expression changed. The guarded look he had carried for days slowly disappeared. Never been someone I didn't need. Answer came so naturally that Jimin didn't realize what he had admitted until the words were already in the air. Jungkook smiled weakly. Then why didn't you tell me about Mrs. Han? Jimin looked toward the city lights. Because every time I thought about it, I kept telling myself there would be a better moment. He laughed quietly. It turns out waiting for the perfect moment is how people lose the important ones. Rooftop fell silent again, but this silence no longer felt cold, it felt peaceful. Jungkook carefully folded the letter and returned it to the velvet box. I understand now. Do you? I think so, he smiled gently. Ring wasn't about choosing someone, it was about honoring someone. Jimin nodded. Exactly. The first time in days they looked at each other without misunderstanding standing between them. The tension that had shadowed every conversation slowly melted away, replaced by the familiar comfort they had almost forgot. As they prepared to leave the rooftop, Jimin suddenly stopped. Been thinking, Jungkook raised an eyebrow. About what? Mrs. Han wanted kindness to keep moving from one person to another. He looked down at the ring. Maybe Minyu was right. Didn't need the ring, so. What will you do with it? Jimin smiled. I won't decide tonight. Wait until I meet someone who truly needs a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life. Jungkook nodded, and when that day comes, be there. Two of them walked back toward the stairwell together. For the first time since the misunderstanding began, their footsteps echoed in perfect rhythm just as they always had. The ring remained safely inside its velvet box, not as a symbol of love, not as the promise of marriage, but as a quiet reminder that trust is built not by assumptions, but by the courage to ask, to listen, and to believe the heart of someone who matters. Several weeks passed, and life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The practice room once again echoed with laughter that bounced off mirrored walls. Conversations flowed effortlessly between rehearsals, and the invisible distance that had once separated Jimin and Jungkook quietly disappeared. Yet something had changed, not in the way they spoke, not in the way they smiled, but in the way they listened. Whenever one of them hesitated, the other noticed. Whenever silence lingered too long, neither allowed assumptions to fill the empty space. The misunderstanding had left behind an unexpected gift: patience. One Saturday afternoon, Jimin slipped the velvet box into his jacket pocket before leaving the dorm. Jungkook noticed immediately. Taking it with you again? Jimin nodded. I think today feels right. For what? I'm not sure yet. Jungkook smiled. Come with you. Together they wandered through quiet streets where autumn had begun painting the trees in shades of amber and crimson. Dry leaves danced across the sidewalks whenever the wind stirred, creating a soft whisper beneath their footsteps. Their destination wasn't planned. They simply walked. After nearly an hour, they found themselves near the old neighborhood where Mrs. Han's music center had once stood. The building was gone. Construction fences surrounded the empty lot. Only one thing remained untouched: the small community park beside it. Children laughed as they chased each other between swings and slides, while elderly neighbors sat beneath tall ginkgo trees sharing warm tea. Jimin smiled. She would have loved this. Before Jungkook could answer, a frightened cry echoed across the park. A little girl stood beside a broken bicycle, tears streaming down her cheeks. Its chain had slipped loose and the front wheel refused to turn. Several people glanced over before returning to their conversations. Everyone seemed too busy. Without hesitation, Jungkook walked toward her. It's okay, he knelt beside the bicycle. Let's see what's wrong. Girl sniffled. My father fixed everything. Looked down sadly, but he's working today. Jungkook rolled up his sleeves. I can't promise I'll do it as well as your father. I'll try. Jimin watched quietly from beneath the tree. Sunlight filtered through golden leaves, illuminating the simple scene before him. No cameras, no audience, no applause, just one person choosing kindness because someone needed help. Nearly 20 minutes later, the bicycle chain clicked back into place. Jungkook spun the pedals, the wheel turned smoothly. There, little girl's eyes sparkled. It works. She threw her arms around Jungkook before racing happily across the park. Her joyful laughter lingered long after she disappeared. Jungkook laughed softly as he brushed grease from his hands. I forgot how messy bicycles are. When he turned around, he noticed Jimin standing silently a few meters away. What? Jimin reached into his pocket. Slowly, he removed the familiar velvet box. Jungkook blinked. What are you doing? I finally understand, Mrs. Han. He opened the box. The silver ring reflected the afternoon sunlight. I kept searching for someone extraordinary. His eyes met Jungkook's. But kindness doesn't announce itself. It simply appears. Jungkook looked at the ring, then back at Jimin. I already told you. I know, you don't need it. Jimin smiled. But I want you to keep it. Jungkook frowned in confusion. Why me? Because every time someone needed help today, you moved before anyone else. You didn't stop to wonder whether someone was watching. You didn't expect anything in return. Jimin gently placed the velvet box into Jungkook's hands. This isn't a reward. It isn't ownership. Isn't a confession. It's trust. Jungkook looked down at the weathered silver ring resting inside the box. Suddenly, the misunderstanding that had once hurt them both felt incredibly distant. He finally understood why Jimin had protected the ring for so many years. It had never been about finding the perfect person. It had always been about finding someone who would continue its meaning. Jungkook closed the box carefully. Protect it. Jimin smiled warmly. I know. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried children's laughter across the park while golden leaves drifted lazily to the ground around them. Mrs. Han's music center no longer stood there. Its walls had vanished. Its piano had fallen silent, but the kindness she had believed in continued quietly, carried from one heart to another, asking for nothing except the courage to keep passing it forward. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, Jimin and Jungkook walked home side by side, their conversation light, their smiles genuine, and their friendship stronger than it had ever been. Not because they had never misunderstood each other, but because they had learned that trust grows strongest when people choose honesty over fear and understanding over assumption. Months passed, and winter settled gently over the city. Snow covered rooftops in soft white layers, muting the noise of traffic and wrapping familiar streets in a peaceful stillness. The cold air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, While warm lights glowed behind frosted windows, life moved forward, schedules became busier, concert preparations filled nearly every day, and the members often practiced until long after midnight. Yet no matter how exhausting the days became, one small tradition quietly remained. Every Friday evening, Jimin and Jungkook visited a different neighborhood to volunteer without announcing who they were. Sometimes they packed meals for families in need. Sometimes they cleaned community gardens. Sometimes they simply spent time listening to elderly people whose greatest wish was to have someone willing to hear their stories. Neither of them spoke much about the ring anymore. It rested safely inside Jungkook's desk drawer, wrapped in the same velvet box. He had never worn it. He never intended to. Some promises were meant to be carried in the heart rather than on a finger. One snowy afternoon, as rehearsal ended earlier than expected, Jungkook received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end sounded familiar. Jungkook, yes, this is Mr. Lee, the caretaker from Mrs. Han's music center. Jungkook smiled in surprise. Remember you. Been sorting through the last of Mrs. Han's belongings. There was something addressed to both you and Jimin. An hour later they arrived at the caretaker's modest house on the outskirts of the city. The home smelled faintly of old paper and freshly brewed tea. Books lined every wall and photographs of former music students filled wooden shelves. Mr. Lee welcomed them with a warm smile before placing a small wooden box on the table. I found this hidden inside the old piano. Jimin looked at the box in astonishment. Never seen it before. Mr. Lee nodded. I hadn't either. There was a note attached. He handed the folded paper to Jimin. With careful hands, Jimin unfolded it. Mrs. Han's familiar handwriting greeted them once again. If you are reading this, it means the ring has already found its next guardian. But kindness should never depend on a single object. Inside this box is something even more important. Jimin slowly opened the wooden lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. Each envelope carried a different name. Some were addressed to former students, some to neighbors. Some simply read, for the person who feels forgot. Jungkook picked up one envelope. It had never been sealed. Inside was a short letter. You may believe no one notices your kindness because nobody applauds it. But goodness has a quiet echo. Long after people forget your face, they remember how safe they felt beside you. Room fell silent. There were no expensive treasures inside the box, no jewelry, no money, only words, words capable of reaching lonely hearts. Mr. Lee smiled gently. And spent years writing those. She hoped someone would deliver them one day. Jimin looked around the room, overwhelmed. There are so many. 112, Mr. Lee replied. Grown too old to find everyone. Without hesitation, Jungkook looked toward Jimin. We'll do it. Jimin met his eyes. No discussion was necessary, no explanation, just quiet understanding. Over the following weeks, they searched for every person whose name appeared on those envelopes. Some had moved to different cities. Some had changed jobs, some had grown old. A few had already passed away, leaving families who accepted the letters with tears in their eyes. Every delivery revealed another story, another life touched by Mrs. Han's compassion. One snowy evening, after delivering the final envelope, Jimin and Jungkook stood outside the old music center's empty lot once again. Nothing remained except the wind brushing across the frozen ground. Jungkook slipped his hands into his coat pockets. We finished. Jimin nodded. Quite, he smiled toward the quiet neighborhood. Kindness doesn't really have a final delivery. Jungkook laughed softly. I guess Mrs. Han planned that. I think she did. They stood together in comfortable silence as snowflakes drifted gently from the dark sky. Neither of them noticed the elderly woman watching from across the street. She had received one of Mrs. Han's letters years ago. Seeing the two young men standing where the music center once stood, she smiled to herself. Promise is still alive, she whispered, and somewhere beneath the fresh blanket of snow, although the old building had disappeared, its greatest lesson endured, not in a silver ring, nor in a collection of letters, but in the quiet decision of ordinary people to choose kindness again and again without expecting the world to notice. Spring arrived quietly, painting the city with blossoms that swayed gently beneath clear blue skies. The cold winds of winter had faded, replaced by warm mornings filled with birdsong and the scent of fresh flowers. 1 year had passed since the day a simple silver ring had nearly driven two friends apart. The practice room looked exactly as it always had. The mirrors reflected the same familiar faces. The piano still stood in the corner. The afternoon sunlight still poured through the tall windows. Yet everyone who entered that room had changed in ways no mirror could reveal. Jimin stood beside the old piano, his fingers resting lightly on its polished surface. Across the room, Jungkook laughed with the others, the easy warmth in his smile returning without hesitation. When rehearsal ended, the members gradually left, offering cheerful goodbyes before disappearing into the hallway. Soon, only Jimin and Jungkook remained. Neither of them hurried to leave. The quiet no longer felt uncomfortable, it felt like home. Jimin walked toward the piano and carefully opened a small drawer hidden beneath the keyboard. Inside rested a faded photograph of Mrs. Han smiling beside a group of children during one of her music classes. Jungkook stepped closer. I still wish I could have met her. Jimin smiled. I think you already have. Jungkook looked at him curiously. Every time you help someone without expecting anything back. Jimin glanced at the photograph. You're continuing the lesson she spent her whole life teaching. Jungkook lowered his eyes with a gentle smile. I used to think that ring changed everything. Jimin laughed softly. It didn't. Changed us. He looked at Jungkook. Was finally choosing to trust each other. Jungkook nodded. Almost lost that because I believed what I imagined instead of asking what was true. I almost lost it because I was afraid to explain. They both smiled, recognizing how close they had come to letting fear destroy something precious. As they prepared to leave, Jungkook reached into his backpack and placed the familiar velvet box on top of the piano. Jimin looked at it in surprise. Ring, Jungkook nodded. Been thinking. He looked around the empty room. It doesn't belong to either of us. Jimin remained silent. It belongs to the promise. Together they carried the velvet box to a newly opened community music center built only a few streets away from where Mrs. Hand's old school had once stood. Children's laughter echoed through bright hallways lined with colorful drawings and tiny pianos waiting for new students. The director welcomed them warmly. When Jimin explained the story behind the ring, the director listened with quiet admiration. Without ceremony, without cameras, and without anyone seeking recognition, they placed the velvet box inside a small glass case near the entrance. Beside it rested a simple handwritten card. This ring is not a symbol of engagement or marriage. It is a reminder that the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life. If you leave this place with a kinder heart than when you entered, its promise continues. Weeks later, children began asking about the ring. Teachers told them the story. Parents shared it with their families. Visitors paused to read the message before quietly smiling to themselves. The ring never left the building again. It no longer needed to. Its purpose had grown beyond one person, one friendship, or one misunderstanding. Years later, long after memories of that rainy afternoon had softened with time, Jimin and Jungkook returned to the music center together. The glass case remained exactly where they had left it. A little boy stood in front of it, reading the handwritten card with careful concentration. He turned to his grandmother. Can kindness really be passed from one person to another? She smiled and gently squeezed his hand. It already has. Jimin and Jungkook exchanged a quiet glance. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The answer stood before them in every child who learned to care, every stranger who chose compassion, and every heart that understood love was never measured by grand gestures, expensive gifts, or sparkling jewelry. Sometimes, the greatest expression of love was simply choosing trust over suspicion, honesty over fear, and kindness over pride. They walked away from the music center side by side, disappearing into the golden light of the afternoon, leaving behind no legend, no celebration, and no expectation of being remembered. Only a promise that would continue with every person who discovered that a simple silver ring had never been about a proposal or a wedding. It had always been about reminding the world that kindness, once given sincerely, never truly comes to an end. The end.